Okay, this is my video on the progression of welding, and this is our original Iron Force Campbell Sheffield, and had a 5-year warranty, and it was like 250 bucks. This is, I think, almost 20 years old. It still works, getting towards the end of its life, or needs to be some updates. The gun's about wore out. It's the reason why I bought it is because it's 110 and it welds anything steel pretty good for farm use, working on cars, installed floor pans with it, and seems to work real nice. In fact, it still works, but you know, it's 20 years old. All this is starting to get wore out, starting to get old. So even though it still works, it just being 110 wasn't quite powerful enough. So then what we wanted to do was move up, and this is just an ARC 160D, and it's a stick welder, but you can do the bigger rods and weld heavier duty stuff because it is 210. We have used this on 210, but I have this adapter because I've used it a lot on 110. And again, I think this was like 200 bucks, but we needed some heavy duty thick welding on some of our trailers, so that's what we used for that. So then we needed to try to do aluminum welding, and so I bought this because it has the gas for aluminum welding. But then I quickly realized that it didn't have a spool gun. So basically it had to push this aluminum wire through this 8-foot cable. And even though it worked and I used it, got my $250 worth out of it for sure, I used it for a whole lot of aluminum welding, I struggled. It would spool up. It would spool up right in here. And so when the wire got stuck somewhere in this long wire, that's what I was trying to do here to keep it straight. If it had any kind of bend in it, it would spool up right here and just push and just make a big mess. So we converted this one to replace our original one. So now this has got steel in it, and it can push the steel through that long cable just fine, and you don't need the gas anymore, but it's there. And again, the whole thing was, this is 210, 220 or 110, so you just use this same adapter, plug it in, and you could weld thicker stuff because of the heat. So that's been a real good gun. So now the progression was to be able to weld aluminum with a spool gun. So again, I misread this. I thought for sure that this had the 4-pin connector, but this is not the connector that came with this. It was a 4-pin connector, but only had 2 pins that worked, and that is this one. So basically, again, it was trying to push the aluminum out this 8-foot lead, and this one actually spooled up in here, not in here, so it just totally filled up. When I pulled this thing out, this one actually has a hole for the wire to go through. This one doesn't because it's got a spool gun. It just filled this whole pocket. This whole thing was just stuffed full of aluminum wire till it stopped working. So again, you could use that for steel. No reason, you know, flux core, I never used it for that. I used it for aluminum and just struggled, and then just gave up. So what I did was I ordered this wiring kit that had a switch and the new plug, and you had to wire it to the motor, and that bypasses this motor and uses the motor and the spool gun. Now I haven't used this yet, and I struggled. This didn't work at first, and I think it didn't work at first because I don't think these wires were connecting good in there, and I messed with it, took it apart, messed with it, and it finally started working. So now I can spool gun weld. So the wire is just in that little spool gun, and this one was about $325 with taxes and shipping. And I have all this aluminum stuff to weld, so aluminum is very expensive. To weld that box right there was 800 bucks to weld that 4 pieces together and weld it to the base. So I mean, that was critical, so I really needed to take it to somewhere that somebody that could weld good and not have leaks. But all this stuff, it doesn't matter if it's leaks or the welds aren't perfect, it just has to be welded. So I can pay myself to do that. So that's progression of welding. You have to have 4-pin capable to do a spool gun. So I don't recommend buying something like that, because the switch was $75, that was $60, so that's $3, $4, about $4.50 that I have in this machine. And you can just buy one with this spool gun for 600 bucks is the cheapest one. And I should have just spent the 600 bucks because it was a nightmare trying to get that and wire it. So that's the progression of welding for us, and doing your own jobs. You'll learn to weld pretty quick. It may not be perfect, but a lot of these things just doesn't matter if it looks good or perfect, just as long as it's stronger than it was to begin with.